This is the 50th episode in the arcade port series, and so I thought I'd do a ports video on one of the most famous top-down vertical scrolling shooters of all time. This is Ikari Warriors, which released in arcades in 1986 by the one and only SNK. Now let me tell you, we have some truly bad home conversions in this video. There will likely be platforms it was on that you wasn't aware of. Yes, this game released on pretty much everything during the 1980s. One particular version that the USA got was so awful it baffled me how it was released at all. So the game itself, although similar to Commando, which I've already covered in the past, this game featured rotary joysticks as well as a two-player co-op mode. The game was originally designed to be an official licensed arcades game for Rambo First Blood Part 2, which I personally say the greatest Rambo film of all time. The scene where John blows up the helicopter after pretending he was dead was just awesome. So SNK were unable to get the rights and release this as Ikari Warriors. So as always, we are ranking from worst to best, and let me remind you, if you don't agree with my rankings, please act responsibly. Nobody wants to read comments of fully grown men sounding like men children. We are adults, people. An absolute disgrace of a Commodore 64 game. To make matters worse, this American release actually had the cheat to ask people to pay for this. I will put it like this, there is better highly polished shoot 'em up destruction public domain games than this. I mean, really, where do I start? Let's start by starting the game to have an enemy who looks like he is having a fit as he walks left and right in his own world. You walk through the game, generally the game centralizes your sprite to give us a view of enemies to come. Here, we almost walk to the top of the screen in which you can easily get hit. The music is embarrassing for a Commodore 64 game. I mean, just look at it. Thankfully, the European market got a much better version of Ikari Warriors. This trash released in 1986 by Data East. Lord have mercy if you had this version back in the day. Can you actually believe it that the Atari 2600 got a port of Ikari Warriors in 1989 by Atari Corporation? Sure, now you might laugh at this, but if you look closer and listen to it, you'll realise for a 1977 home console, which sported some of the most basic games, this is actually an achievement. If you know about the 1970s hardware, firstly, the sprites are really nicely animated here and have different shades rather than just one blocky colour. Yes, it looks rudimentary, and yes, it doesn't much resemble that arcade game, but come on, little details included here is that when we are walking through rivers, the programmer has actually chopped off the player's legs to give us depth. Control wise is slightly wooden admittedly, holding down fire button throws grenades. Collision detection is fairly good here. It is likely the most basic you will get of Ikari Warriors, with a constant loop of what you see progressively getting more difficult as you go on, like most Atari 2600 games. Now, if you were into bad games and find them quirky and fun to play, this is the Apple II's Data East 1987 release. Again, just like the Atari 2600, this machine released in 1977 too, and so to have a game releasing 10 years into the computer's life is fairly impressive, let alone a game like Ikari Warriors, which is a fairly demanding game, even for a higher end computer to the 1980s. So as you can see, if you are familiar with the colours used on Apple II games, this is no exception. Much like the ZX Spectrum in uniqueness, that is. There is no opening to the game, you can control either joystick or keyboard to play, and the game starts straight away pretty much. Controlling is a little on the wooden side and hit collision detection is a little wonky, but the point is, it kind of resembles what it is going for to achieve. The gameplay area seems narrow just like the arcade game. Getting inside the tanks is also a little odd to control, no music here, just very basic sound effects used. Not many people likely realise, but the Commodore 16 and Commodore Plus 4 models had a conversion of Ikari Warriors, releasing back in 1987 by Elite. Let's just consider that the Commodore Plus 4 had very basic hardware for games, unlike the C64. These Commodore computers were mainly aimed at businesses and education, so to pull off a game like this isn't a bad attempt at all. If you watch my Russian Attack ports video, you will truly realise how polished this game looks. It's not great, and I did find myself dying even if I didn't get shot. I'd literally just stand a few millimeters away from the enemy from time to time and I'll just randomly die. So collision detection is pretty bad here really, but when it works it's not that bad. Everything considering what this is actually running on. Again, no introduction to the game, no music, fairly rudimentary sound effects, it's missing bits and pieces of scenery, but our hero actually moves like he does in the arcade game. Compared to the IBM PC's version of Contra that I uploaded yesterday, then Ikari Warriors is a game light years ahead of this. Is it perfect? No, not at all, but to be fair, it actually doesn't look that bad for a DOS arcade conversion. For those who have been watching all of these videos of arcade ports in this series, you had seen over time some really bad DOS games or DOS conversions. It is on the slow side in terms of frame rates, but it does the job to an extent. We also get no introduction with airplane crashing into the jungle. It is basic, but at least it is following the narrow formula of gameplay. I particularly like grenades being launched here. The death of them being thrown doesn't look bad at all. Hit collision detection is pretty good here. Not the best, but a step in the right direction. No music, just some bland sound effects. Data East published this one back in 1987. I was kind of optimistic about the Atari 7800's port of this game, as when I tested and uploaded my Commando ports video sometime back, the 7800 port was actually pretty good. Now I won't say that this game is terrible, it looks good, especially the crashing airplane sequence prior to the game beginning. The colours are pretty nice here too. The real issue with this 1990 port by Atari Corporation is its pure insane difficulty level. We get an option with this version to change difficulty levels. I played it on Novice. This setting just felt like the difficulty level selection either didn't work or was just there for show. Seriously, this version was very tough. Bullets flying everywhere and grenades being repeatedly launched by enemies. The music wasn't that great either. The 7800 could actually do better in this. The sound effects, which were also combined in the gameplay, wasn't too wonderful either. When shooting enemies, it felt a little off where it wasn't clear if I actually killed enemies, as they do a staggering effect similar to the arcade game, but here it just looked odd and was a little bit confusing. Now, this will likely be an instant dislike for this video, but dear lord, I couldn't believe what I was playing with this 1987 SNK release for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It looks great, but looks can be deceiving. This is awful to play. It is stiff to control and ridiculously slow, to the point where even for a Nintendo NES game, this isn't entertaining at all. It's likely the most janky NES game I've ever played. I normally have a very good idea in this port series of where particular systems will likely rank. I left the NES version of Ikari Warriors until last. I really had no idea how terrible this version was. If you haven't played this version, give it a go and you'll see what I mean. It doesn't particularly start great either with the airplane crash animation. Even this is janky to watch in itself. A little bit like the Nintendo Entertainment System's conversion, the Atari ST suffered the same fate. Looks are deceiving. The only reason I've ranked this version here is that it looks much like the arcade game, but by no means this is a fast-paced game. Although the NES port was particularly bad, and this one a little worse with frame rate issues, this one actually seemed to play and look a little better. I think it is a fact at this point that Atari ST games couldn't scroll too well whilst dealing with many things happening at once at the same time. Ikari Warriors Warriors clearly shows this. This version released by Elite in 1988. All I can say here is that it's such a shame that the gameplay was so slow here, because despite this, it looks really nice. The sprites themselves are really nicely detailed too, with the tanks also looking particularly nice. Every now and then, I get people whining because I place an Amstrad as the worst version of a particular arcade game port. Today, you are in luck. I think the Elite 1987 release is pretty damn good. Sure, it suffers from frame drops, but in general, it's a fairly decent version, which is fairly good to control too. There is no music here. I played this with sound effects and it doesn't sound too bad. The colours are really nice, and the best part of this version is that the coder actually put this into an almost vertical ratio, just like the arcade original game. Throwing grenades is good and responsive, and that explosion sounds brilliant when blowing up buildings. It's a fairly challenging game. It's definitely up there with some of the best Amstrad CPC home arcade conversions. Sadly, it doesn't come with the main introduction airplane crash sequence, but considering how good this Amstrad game is, I totally forgive it. I found this ZX Spectrum version difficult to rank between this and the Amstrad CPC conversion. I decided this just seems overly better to control, especially when controlling the tank. It does lag a little from time to time, but overall a quicker, fast-paced game compared with the Amstrad's version. Sure, the colours are there and we have some sound effects, but overall, this port just seemed much better to play in general. Elite released this 48 and 128K Spectrum game back in 1988. Shooting at enemies just seemed a lot easier and nicer in this version. Rather than doing the awkward staggering away, they just stand in one single space and just pretty much spin around and die, so there's no weird staggering effect here used. It's also gone for the narrow vertical look, like the arcade original. Blowing up buildings with grenades is also pretty satisfying here. I will note here that originally a Spectrum game was actually written in 1986 before this version, but was never released. This is the version of Ikari Warriors that America would have loved back in the late 1980s. This is Ikari Warriors European style. All I'll say is, damn, this version is one of the hardest games around. As a kid, I loved to play the game, which was simply called Arnie, and for some reason, this game reminded me of it. Not that it's an isometric game, maybe it's sprite design, who knows. Despite its toughness, it looks like a premium game of that era. Music is really nicely done here, of course, and the sound effects are really good too. It took me a few attempts to get to grips of how the enemies engage, and after finding their patterns of movement, yeah, it's really good version of this game. We don't have that vertical centralized look here, but it does its best to look similar to the source material. It controls really well too, and again, just like the Amstrad and Spectrum ports, this one feels good bombing things. Any boy growing up in the 1980s loved destruction. Let's face it, action films and blowing up stuff was a major part of popular culture back in those days. Elite honoured the European market with this in 1988. So SNK themselves developed their MSX2 conversion back in 1987. This is a great 8-bit conversion and likely the best overall 8-bit port for Ikari Warriors. Yes, the music is terrible, but we have some voice synth here when dying. It sounds pretty good, to be honest. When enemies get hit, they splash with blood, which I think looks really smart. Of course, it's got a full screen of gameplay, but it does work and do the job just fine. It is a challenging game, although I managed to get further with this version compared to the Commodore 64's European Death Festival release. It's really responsive to control, and getting in the tanks give you a particular power where destruction is inevitable. Oddly enough, tanks are actually icons in this conversion rather than sprites, so to speak. It's a decent version and it's very colourful too, just a shame it wasn't presented with a whole vertical look, otherwise this likely could have ranked higher. One thing to note, it does tend to have some slowdowns, but it could be much worse like other versions we've seen. From janky versions of this game to other versions which didn't go for the arcade's vertical and centralized look, this Amiga's 1988 Elite release has it all. Is this a perfect arcade port though? Well, no, but having said that, pretty much every version of Ikari Warriors has its flaws, some worse than others. The Commodore Amiga's version, however, was actually fun to play. It operates at a fairly good speed, although it does drop in frames from time to time. Like I say, it's not perfect, but likely the best version to play if you didn't have the SNK arcade machine in your bedroom at the time, which was fairly unlikely. This was likely one of the best home conversions. Now, if you are one of those people who claims I am biased with placing Amiga in first place in the past few episodes, please watch my entire playlist of this series. Remember, this is the 50th episode. You will then see that this is far from the case. Amiga had some real trash in its day. The choice of colours used here are awesome. It's presented in probably the best ratio to the arcade game itself. For those versions which gave us an animated plane crashing introduction, most were fairly slow, almost struggling. The Amiga's version, on the other hand, seems to animate this at ease. Like I say, is it the best Amiga conversion ever? No, but certainly in my opinion, the best version of this game outside of the arcade game itself, and that's why I simply rank this one in first place. And that's it for today's ranking of various home conversions of Ikari Warriors. Let us know in the comments if you were unfortunate enough to be in America at the time and have that godforsaken Commodore 64 release. Or did you have a better release? Did you have it for, say, the Atari ST or even the Amstrad CPC version, which was equally pretty good? But anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.